In the spring of 1933, under the chilling shadow of Stalin's regime, a horrific chapter of human suffering unfolded on a remote island in Siberia. Known as the Nazino Tragedy or Cannibal Island, this grim experiment turned into a nightmarish descent into chaos and cannibalism. The Soviet government's plan to resettle socially undesirable citizens to remote, uninhabited areas resulted in the death of thousands, exposing the brutal extremes of Stalin's policies and the harrowing depths of human desperation. This story begins with the Soviet Union's policy of dekulakization, aimed at eliminating perceived enemies of the state. Kulaks, or wealthy peasants, were targeted during Stalin's collectivization efforts. But this policy soon expanded to include anyone deemed undesirable, such as petty criminals, political dissidents, and those unable to conform to the state's rigid ideals. These individuals were labeled as parasites and rounded up by the thousands in Stalin's drive to purge society. In 1933, Soviet authorities devised a plan to exile these so-called socially harmful elements to uninhabited regions of Siberia and Kazakhstan, forcing them to develop agricultural settlements from scratch. One such location was Nazino Island, an isolated stretch of land in the Ob River, approximately 500 miles north of Tomsk. The island, barren and inhospitable, was utterly unsuitable for human habitation. On May 18, 1933, the first group of deportees arrived at Nazino Island. Approximately 6,000 people were crammed onto overcrowded barges and ferried to the island, carrying little more than the clothes on their backs. Many were in poor health after enduring weeks of brutal transport conditions with minimal food, water, or sanitation. The authorities who managed this operation were entirely unprepared for the scale of the task, and they failed to provide even the most basic supplies. Upon arrival, the deportees were left with no tools, no shelter, and no means to cultivate the land. The island was nothing more than a desolate swamp, offering no resources for survival. The food rations, which consisted mainly of flour, were grossly inadequate. Even worse, the flour was distributed haphazardly, often dumped in the dirt for individuals to scavenge. Desperate for sustenance, many mixed the flour with contaminated river water, leading to outbreaks of dysentery and other diseases. Within days, chaos consumed the island. Hunger and sickness spread rapidly, and the lack of organization among the guards only exacerbated the situation. The deportees, already weakened and desperate, began to turn on each other. Violent clashes erupted over the meager supplies, and soon reports of cannibalism began to emerge. Survivors would later recount harrowing tales of how the strongest preyed upon the weak. Groups of individuals hunted others for food, carving the flesh of the dead, or even the living, in a desperate bid to survive. These acts of cannibalism were not isolated incidents. They became a horrifying norm as starvation tightened its grip on the island. The guards, armed and indifferent, did little to intervene. Many of them were poorly trained and as under-resourced as the deportees themselves. Corruption was rampant, with guards often bartering flour for valuables or exploiting the vulnerable for personal gain. In some cases, they used brutal force to maintain order, but more often they simply watched as the nightmare unfolded. After several weeks of unimaginable suffering, Soviet authorities finally recognized the catastrophic failure of the Nazino experiment. By the end of June 1933, officials began evacuating survivors from the island. However, of the roughly 6,000 people sent to Nazino, fewer than 2,000 were still alive. The rest had succumbed to starvation, disease, violence, or despair. The Nazino tragedy was a direct consequence of Stalin's ruthless policies and the regime's disregard for human life. The deportees were never properly screened or prepared for such an extreme relocation. Many of them were ordinary citizens caught in the gears of a merciless system, exiled without due process or any real justification. For decades, the Soviet government suppressed information about the tragedy, keeping it hidden from public view. It wasn't until the late 20th century, during the period of glasnost under Mikhail Gorbachev that the details of Nazino Island began to emerge. In 1988, historian Nicholas Wirth uncovered official documents and survivor testimonies that shed light on the horrific events. His work revealed the full extent of the suffering and the callousness of the policies that led to it. The Nazino tragedy stands as a haunting reminder of the dangers of totalitarian regimes and the devastating human cost of ideological zeal. It serves as a stark example of what can happen when a government prioritizes political goals over the welfare of its people. Today, Nazino Island remains uninhabited, a silent witness to the horrors that unfolded there. While the physical traces of the tragedy have long since faded, the memory of what happened serves as an enduring warning against the dehumanization of vulnerable populations. The legacy of the Nazino tragedy lives on, not just in the annals of history, but also in the collective memory of those who value human dignity and justice. It compels us to remember the countless lives lost to inhumanity and to strive for a world where such atrocities are never repeated.